Hello, everyone, and welcome again to the fourth lecture of the second edition of the Current Topics in Heritage Science series of the EIHS Academy. This lecture series is organized by Emerging Professional in the frame of the EIHS project and the European Research Infrastructure for Heritage Science. My name is Fabiana Di Gianvincenzo. I am a researcher at the Heritage Science Laboratory at the University of Ljubljana, and I will be moderating today's lecture on the topic Open and Fair Science with a case study from the FAIR Phytoliths Project delivered by Dr. Emma Karoune. The recording of this lecture will be available on the E-RIHS EU YouTube channel. At the end of the lecture, you will receive a survey. Please take a few minutes to complete the survey and let us know your opinion. You will receive an attendance certificate for this lecture once you complete the survey. You can ask questions to the speaker using the Q&A function at the bottom bar of the Zoom window. And if you are experiencing any technical difficulties, you can contact us using the chat. I am now happy to present today's speaker, Dr. Emma Karoune. Dr. Karoune is a Software Sustainability Institute Fellow focusing on promoting a more accessible and inclusive research culture. Dr. Karoune works at the Alan Turing Insitute as a Senior Research Community Manager across multi-domains. She's a core contributor to the Turing Way and is working closely with the Turing Skills Team to lead a project on professionalizing traditional and modern data science roles. She is the Principal Investigator on the FAIR Phytolith Project. She is also working with Elixir-UK as a FAIR Data Stewardship Training Fellow to develop training resources for FAIR data management and works closely with the Open Life Science Program as mentor and expert. Thank you for accepting our invitation, Dr. Karoune, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you. Thanks for a really nice introduction. I can cut my own one very short now. So I will just share my screen and then I'll do the presenter. Can you just give me a thumbs up? You can see the slides nicely. Yeah, great. So it's already been said what I'm going to talk about. So I'm a huge fan of, or I really work in open research, and that is the drive of all my research at the moment, whatever domain I'm working in. As Fabiana said, I work at the Alan Turing Insitute, so I'm actually joining you from our offices, which are in the British Library in London. It's a fabulous place to have an office, so I'm actually there today. And yeah, I work as a Senior Research Community Manager, which is a researcher that focuses on community building and implementing and embedding open research into multiple projects. So I work a lot with the health programme at the Turing. And you might think that's a bit weird because my background is archaeology, but I find I've got loads of skills actually, because archaeological data, most of it's missing in our data sets. It's also the case with health data. So I'm actually pretty good at health, contributing to health projects as well, and particularly leading the open research implementation in those projects. I also work for the Turing Way, and I've got a slide about that at the end, so I won't talk about that. But I'm really here today to talk about my work at Historic England, where I was leading a project on FAIR data, particularly in my own discipline, which I'm an archaeobotanist, but I specialise in microscopic plants and particularly phytoliths. And I will tell you what those are, because you're probably wondering what they are as well. And I'll talk about those later. And yeah, I think I'm gonna get going because Fabiana did a really good introduction to me, so I should just keep going. So I'm going to talk today about all these different things. So it's going to be a whirlwind tour of open science, so what it's all about, why we as researchers should be practicing open science now. So I'm going to make quite a strong case for that, so be prepared. I'm also going to tell you the benefits for you and for the general wider scientific community of why we should barriers to doing it at the moment. And then I'm going to go on to talk about this case study, which is the project that I've been leading called the FAIR Phytolith Project, which really is trying to quite widely in a discipline implement open research or open science practices. So it's a really good sort of example of trying to move and change the research culture of a particular discipline. So to start off with, what is open science? I think when I first started working in open science, I was really confused because there are lots of different terms which are used, and I think these all really mean the same thing. They are umbrella terms for really thinking about implementing all of these different open science practices. So in this talk, I will probably use these terms interchangeably, and that's because my personal understanding is that they all pretty much mean the same thing. They mean about trying to open up your research in any way possible, really. So where has open science actually come from? It actually, being an archaeologist, I like to think about it in the long past. So it actually really started in the Middle Ages, where there was a culture of open science that first was made possible and positively encouraged by the system of aristocratic patronage by kings and well-off nobles that saw the benefits of sponsoring philosophers and really people of starting scientific thinking and learning. And then in the 17th century, open science became much more visible in public life when the first science periodicals were published. So the first science associations were founded in 1660, which was the Royal Society of London for improving natural knowledge. And this association actually had a strong emphasis on open science and was one of the first to include women in these discussions, which obviously was quite significant. This scientific revolution occurred due to an increase in the importance of mathematics as a discipline, but also due to a change in technology. And that was the change and the spread of printing press, actually being able to publish research, which hadn't been actually possible before. And actually, the current surge in open research that we've seen in the 20th and 21st century actually is also closely linked with a change in technology, and that change is the development of the internet and related technologies, such as the different tools and communication channels that we now use for our research. One of the other drivers for this current surge in research moving towards openness has been this worry about lack of reproducibility in research in general. So reproducible research is research that can be independently recreated from the same data and the same code that the original team used. And concerns about a lack of reproducibility started in the field of psychology more than 10 years ago, with studies being retracted by journals. And this has actually radiated out from there into pretty much all disciplines now of research. We hear a lot about the phrase reproducibility crisis, and that was actually coined in around the early 2010s. And there was a really useful survey that was conducted by the journal Nature around reproducibility and the reproducibility crisis. And this was responded to by scientists from a very wide range of different disciplines. And they found that actually 90% of the respondents actually thought that there was a crisis of reproducibility in their discipline, or actually science in general, and that 70% of these scientists had tried and failed to reproduce another scientist's experiment. So actually really stark findings across different disciplines that there was a problem within research, and really highlighting that something had to be done about it. I also think that the current open science movement is being accelerated by the ideas and work around sustainability, the climate change sort of topics in research, and also the impact of the COVID pandemic on research that really made us all have to embrace more technological ways of working and actually think about how we can work better together in larger teams, international teams, and how we can make our work more open and sustainable in that way. So starting to really think about implementing openness in all the research we do. So if we are thinking about what actually is open science, so we want to define open science, I've got a good definition here. It's the transformation of research by making it more reproducible, transparent, reusable, collaborative, accountable, and accessible to society. And I think that's a really good point. It's not necessarily for us as researchers that is a benefit, but I think the openness really is about accountability. It's about saying that our work is valid, giving access to our work much more openly than we have done in the past. So anyone can actually access it. So it pushes really for a change in the way we actually do research, the way it's carried out, and actually how we disseminate our research using digital technology. So I've put some of the umbrella terms that I've already mentioned here on top of my umbrella, which I think is this overall arching words for open research, open science, open scholarship. But underneath are these different practices of open science. So we've got things like open data, open source software, or you could call that open analysis, having open methods. So that's also on there as open notebooks, things like citizen science, and things like open access publishing. So really thinking about and implementing all of these different practices can be really, really overwhelming if you've not really thought about it before or had no training. So I would say you do not have to do all of them at once. Don't go for the whole suite of practices. And much of the time you don't actually need to do all of them. It might not be relevant to your research. But it's a really good idea to start moving towards actually implementing some of these practices or finding out about them and implementing them in your own research projects. So the outcomes, they're moving to the why we do or why we should be doing open research. So the outcomes of all of these practices that I've just talked about can really be grouped into two areas or two outcomes. Firstly, it's around sustainability. So the transparency of opening up research leads to the ability to reproduce the research. And this then increases the overall quality of your research, leading to more sustainable research. So, for example, more researchers can reuse your method that you publish, or open data can be further explored. So really, people can understand your work fully, and that means that they then can build on that work in the future. So it means that we get better value out of the research that we're producing. And secondly, the openness and consideration of inclusive practices leads to an overall increase in equity, diversity, inclusion, and accessibility in research for researchers. So I mean that while you're doing research, you are including researchers more and making it more accessible for researchers, but also publishing and saying about your research more openly means that you're including the wider scientific community, but also the general public. And I do personally, so this is my personal opinion, I do think that researchers have a moral and ethical responsibility to open up their research. And this is because most of our research is paid for by the public, it's paid for by government funding. And actually, if we're not opening our research up to people who are like the public, you know, in things like writing lay summaries and writing giving them different ways of accessing it, we're not really doing the full job we could. Actually, we're not really giving the full benefit that our research could have. And if we're not thinking about it in a sustainable way, that's the same. So lots of research is actually wasted because we are not actually open enough and transparent enough about how we do research, and also how we store research for the future and how we sort of disseminate research. So giving you a bit of a practical example here of why do researchers need to practice open science. And this is part of my research project, which I will talk more about in a bit, but part of our FAIR Phytolith project is that we looked at lots of different publications in our discipline. We actually looked at 100 phytolith publications. I've previously done a study which looked at even more publications, but generally what we're finding is that the majority of publications in my discipline, so phytolith research, are not open access. Okay, so this is one of the practices you could do as an open scientist or open researcher. So what we actually found was that, so in our study where we did 100 papers, so 46% of the articles were open access. So that means over half of them were closed access. We also found that most of the data in our discipline is included in published articles. So most of the data is not in data repositories at the moment. That practice is not prevalent throughout our discipline. So if you think about, people are publishing things that are not open access, but their data is also in there. So what does this mean? So it means that actually we're not giving full access to our research at the moment. Not everybody can pay for journals. And actually that's probably many people around the world. My discipline is a global community. And actually I want everybody to be able to see my research. So we are trying to encourage our discipline to be much more open in terms of just open access, opening up their articles. And this is something that I understand people can't afford. They can't always afford to do gold open access, but there are alternatives. You can actually do it for free. You can do green open access, which is you put a version of your article into some sort of repository where anybody can access it. So I just wanted to give that as a very practical example of like actually, if you think about just one aspect, you could actually really improve the access and the equitable access of the research community as well as the public by just publishing everything you do open access. So there are other reasons why we actually do, why we should be doing open science. I've actually talked about the kind of, I suppose, the carrot versions, like the moral, ethical kind of reasons why. This is the stick now. So the why you have to do it, why you must start doing it. So the first is that funders now, a lot of them require you to do open science or at some extent of it. So I'm based in the UK. Our funders are called UKRI, and they now have an open access policy, which means that immediately that you publish your research, it has to be open access if you are funded by them. So that's implemented now. It also means other things as well. It incorporates your data and other research outputs, so not just articles. And that's the requirement of the funder. So, you know, it's something you're having to do when you're writing reports, you're having to show you're doing it. It's also the case in Europe as well. If you have funding from the European Research Council, you have to do it as well. So they're the new Horizon Europe requirements. They do require open access for all of your outputs. You could also work at an institution, so it's worth checking your open research policies or research integrity policies, they're sometimes called, or open access policies of your actual institution. So my institution requires, so the Alan Turing Insitute, we require everything to be published open access. So that's even if we have to find the money to get it done, or green open access, as I said, the free version of it. So, you know, check your policies. It might be that you're missing out that actually you meant to be doing it. The last one of these sticks is that actually there are a growing amount of open access only journals where actually you have to pay for it to be open access. Obviously, at the moment, there are other types of journals, but I think the shift is going to be towards all of journals being completely open access. These ones also have quite strong policies about open data, open methods, and demonstrating that you are having reproducible research. So this is the case for quite a lot of things. So I've put a few on there, which are F1000, there's a Welcome platform, Open Research Europe. So if you are funded through European Research Council, you can put it on there, be fully open with everything. And that actually does all of those require all of your outputs to be fully reproducible. So those are the kind of sticks of why we should be doing open access. So now on to the kind of like the benefits of why you should be doing it. So firstly, it really does increase the quality of your research. What I found with starting to implement this in my own research is that I actually really consider how I do research, because I know I'm going to make it transparent. I actually have much more consideration of how I do my research. So I think really hard about the methods and how I'm going to record the methods, how am I going to record my data as they go along. And actually, a lot of the hard work of doing open science, which is a lot of the recording, is done as I go along. And actually, when I publish at the end, I actually don't have a huge amount more to write because I've done so much recording all the way along. It actually helps me to write research articles more quickly, I find now. And it does also increase your collaboration, because if you're being really open from the start of your research, so you could have a completely open source project. So that means from the moment your research money comes in and you start, you have an open repository where you keep all your work that anybody could see all of the time. So that sounds really scary to some people, but actually you become quite used to actually doing that. I wouldn't say that's not for everybody and can't be done by all disciplines, like health research can't do that sort of open source working all the way through. But if you can do that, it's a really good way of doing it, because more people find out about your research, and actually it does lead to more collaborations, I have found personally. I think I've already talked about sustainability. So sustainable research, it makes all your research more sustainable for other people to build on. And I've already touched on the kind of EDIA aspect, that really it includes more people in your research community in the work you're doing, because you're making your work more accessible. So it means that a more diverse and range of researchers can access your research, which is really important. I also like to include what are the benefits for you personally, because those first ones, I would say they are for the wider scientific community. Everyone is a little bit selfish, so I like to kind of have some benefits which are just for you. So I have found personally, from my personal experience, that I've had an increase in citations, and I'm going to show you some evidence of this from some research, that if you open up your research, you have open access publications, you have open data, you actually get more citations. So that's actually something that all researchers really want. I'm not really a big fan of metrics, but a lot of people are required to monitor things like how many high impact journal articles they have, how many citations. It's kind of the way that a lot of researchers still assess. So if you want that, open science is the way to go, because there is definite proof that you get an increase in citations. That is really off the back of your work being just more discoverable. So that is really great. It increases your visibility as a researcher, I think, because I often talk like this, lots about the research I do. I'm very open. People can access much of my research as I'm going along. So I do have people that just contact me out of the blue about what I'm doing. They want to collaborate with me. So I find that a real benefit. Also, if you practice open science, you actually get credit for all of the work you do. So that might sound weird. You might think, oh, I already get credit for the work I do in a research article. Well, actually, you don't, because what about that really nice method that you were developing in your lab to actually write, collect your data and write your research? Well, you could publish the method by itself and actually get credit for that particular method. People could cite you for your method. You can also have your data set out there on a repository and people can cite that data set as well. So you actually can get credit and particular citations for all of your different research outputs if you actually make them openly available on online repositories, archiving repositories. So you can get more credit for the whole cycle of research that you actually do, not just your kind of end product, which is your research article. So here is the evidence of what I've just said of this benefits of open science practices. So the first one is there are loads of articles actually out there that tell us that you get higher citations for open access papers. So this one that I'm showing you here has actually gathered together lots of different studies on, it's called Open Access Citation Advantage, and they were looking into whether it was a real thing. So they actually found that 76% of these studies into open access citation advantage did actually find that you got the advantage. So it's very likely and positive that you are getting more citations. So that's one bit of evidence. The other one is this paper, which is showing you about having open data, so linking your publications to research data. I have to say, it doesn't actually need to be open. It could just be a repository that you store your data in, such as health data. A lot of that is stored in research data hubs, and actually have to apply to use that data, but still you're linking to that data to find out the information, the metadata about that data. So this study actually found that there was a 25% higher citation impact for papers that did actually include links to data in a repository for that study. So again, more evidence to say you're going to get more citations if you practice open science. So as I said, there is still a lot of barriers to doing open research. And that's because we're currently in a phase of research where we're really transitioning still into these practices. And so I've taken these barriers mostly from the Turing Way book, which I'll talk about a bit later. And some of them are quite specific ones, which in the Turing Way book, we talk quite specifically about barriers to reproducibility, but really I've kind of tried to generalize them to be more about open research. So some of the ones which are sort of the biggest barriers, I think, are things like getting additional skills. So definitely that is a huge barrier, is upskilling. It actually, quite a lot of disciplines don't have computational skills taught within their degrees and master's degrees. And actually, I know in archaeology that tends to be the case. I'm very much a self-taught data scientist, I would say, and my computational skills I kind of learned along the way. So any training you can get along the way in those sorts of skills, because those are the skills actually you need to start applying in open science. You need to use things like GitHub, which is a version control tool. You need to be starting to learn coding languages like R and Python. So those are things where actually you really just got to upskill yourself in. They seem quite scary, but actually I found that actually I really actually enjoy coding and things like that now. I've actually taken to it quite easily, and it just needs a little bit of practice and maybe one project where you use it. So Those sorts of things are additional skills. Also, things like using repositories is another skill that people talk to me about. They find a real barrier. It's like, what repository do they use? How do you actually use it? How do you put your outputs on there? So there are loads of trainings that you can find out there for all of these different things. And I'm going to advertise a few of them at the end of this talk. The other thing which I think is a real barrier to open science is actually language. All of open science generally is done in English. And obviously, me being that being my first language, it's great for me, but it's not great for people who have English as a second language. So I think this is probably the next generation of change in open science, is actually to translate it into all of the different languages. And I'll also talk about this later, because this is something that I've been trying to do in my project, because we are very much a global community in my discipline. So we've really tried to focus on trying to translate all of the things we do into multiple languages to try and make it much more accessible to all the researchers in our discipline. So I'm going to now just do a really quick whiz through the FAIR Phytolith project. And what the FAIR Phytolith project is about is we were seeing this real need for improving data sharing in phytolith research. I've already touched on the fact that we have found in my previous study and also in this study that most of the data in this discipline is found in inaccessible research articles. And that's something we need to change, because, as I said, it's not inclusive, it's not equitable for all the researchers around the world, and it just isn't great for data reuse. So this is something we've been trying to tackle. It's not just me doing this. I had a whole team of lovely people with me, which are on the screen here. We are funded, have been a European project. We've been funded by EOSC Life, so I just wanted to say that. And also we've been supported by Historic England and University of Pompeu Fabra in Barcelona. So thank you to all of those people. So what are phytoliths? So they are microscopic plant remains. They're made of silica, which makes them really, really robust. So for archaeological and paleoecological studies, that's brilliant. They basically last for millions of years if you just leave them somewhere. So they're actually being used for an ever expanding list of research topics, and are used actually across multiple disciplines. So in botany and ecology, archaeology, paleoecology, and paleontology as well. So all those dinosaurs with them on their teeth. So they're really used for reconstructing paleo environments and paleoclimates, but also, like in archaeology, I was using them for looking at what foods people ate and things like that, and thinking about farming regimes and plant domestication and things like that. So they have lots of different uses, and the main quality of a phytolith is that it's really hard to destroy it, which is excellent if you want to look at past climates and past environments. So the FAIR Phytolith project, our aim really was to increase the knowledge of and the use of the FAIR data principles in phytolith research. And we went about this by first of all doing a community survey. So we sent out surveys to all of our researchers in our community to ask them about how they do data sharing now and what their opinions were of changing their practices, like going for open science practices. We also did a FAIR assessment looking at the 100 publications that I've mentioned previously, and we focused on 2 specific regions, Europe and South America. Those are the main regions where, some of the main regions where phytoliths are used. So I'm going to talk in more detail about the FAIR assessment in a minute. The other thing we actually started doing is we started to offer a lot of training in FAIR data and open science tools. And then what we're trying to do at the moment is we're drawing all of this kind of information together from the survey and the FAIR assessment, and we're actually making some recommendations to our community about how we can move forward to have better data sharing. And actually we're drawing up with our community some guidelines for implementing the FAIR data principles in our specific discipline. So you might be thinking, what are the FAIR data principles? So these are a set of guidelines which were released in 2016. And they are really guidelines that have been developed for better data management and stewardship, really for sustainable data management and stewardship. They are general guidelines. So what is actually happening now is that people are doing projects like the FAIR Phytolith project to actually really look to see how these principles can be adapted for specific disciplines, because you can't really just start implementing them. They're actually quite general guidelines. they're very good guidelines, but we actually have to think quite specifically about how they could be implemented in the phytolith discipline, because there are certain elements to the way we do research that are really important. For example, the type of way that we actually name phytoliths, the way that they're standardized is a very specific issue within our discipline that doesn't relate to any other discipline. So our recommendations have to be very specific if we want data sharing to improve in our discipline. So so I just want to talk a bit about the FAIR assessment that we did and the results of that, and then you'll see sort of the impact of the project. So we took 100 publications. We selected 50 from each region. So this was regions where the research was done. So usually archaeological or paleoecological research done in Europe or done in South America. Each of those regions, they have slightly different traditions of the way they do phytolith research. So that's why we picked them. So they use slightly different methods, different ways of naming. And we thought this would give us a good spread of information about how the research was done. Then we set up, so we worked, there was multiple people collecting data. So we actually set up some Google form to actually standardize the way we were collecting data. And what we were doing was asking questions about, actually I'll talk more about that on the next slide, I think, but we asked a series of questions about for each publication to collect the information. And then what we've been doing now, we've already published a data paper to say our full method, so you can actually access that and have a good look at that. That's in Nature Scientific Data. And we've tried to be completely transparent with all the work that we've done. You can access our repository, you can see our data set, all of our documentation that we collected along the way, our forms, and you can see our results because they're already on there, even though we haven't actually published them yet. So we wanted the project to be a good demonstration of how to do open science as well, how to implement in a project. So it's just a good example of actually how you can do that, this sort of project. And it's a kind of qualitative project as well, which is quite interesting, because usually you talk about quantitative projects in open science. So what the questions that we actually asked were sort of general questions about the paper, so who the authors were, you know, where it was published, that sort of thing, the year. We did take specific years, so we had a 5-year period, the last kind of 5 years. We collected questions about whether it was open access, about the methods, how the methods were communicated in the paper, what was done with the data, so where it was, what the files were like, what sort of data it was, because that's what we're really thinking about. Picture inclusion, that's very specific to phytoliths. And because we like to see how what people have identified their phytoliths, so the pictures is really important for you to say, like, this is what I've identified as this. So it actually has quite a big implication on that, you know, the methods that you've used and the results, obviously. And then we also collected some information about the software that was used for the analysis, because we wanted to see how many people were using things like the open source softwares like R and Python in their analysis. So we did 100 articles. What we found actually is that phytolith research is published in a huge variety of journals. And I think this speaks to the fact that this type of analysis is actually practiced in so many different disciplines. So out of the 100 articles, there were 50 different journals that these articles were published in. So this was a random search that we did. So this was, I think, confirming our idea of like where this type of analysis is actually done, but this actually causes a problem for us trying to implement these guidelines that we're producing, because we can't really directly go for like one journal that maybe all the research is published in and say to the editors, please can you help us to try and check the journal articles that you're getting submitted and try and work with us to implement these guidelines. That's not going to work for our discipline because people are publishing in such a huge variety of journals, so we can't take that approach. We did find that most of the studies that happened were, you know, in the past. That's kind of our discipline, but there's also modern ones as well. There's lots of methodological studies and ecological studies that publishing on things like reference collections as well. And this is all relevant to how data is published and how we need to think about data sharing and improving it. As I've already said, most of the articles we found are closed access. Most people also paid for the access, so I think this is a particular problem that people probably aren't understanding very much about green open access. And that's one of the things I generally hear is people always say, oh, but open access, cool, it costs so much money. And that's like one of the main, I think, misconceptions that I hear like all of the time. It actually doesn't cost you anything if you want to have an open access article, because you can publish it in just a repository as a preprint or a postprint, something like that. Lots of our journals, or these journals, the 50 that we found, were hybrid journals. I've already said little use of green open access. And then the methods, we did look, because we were trying to, one of the things I've previously found is that methods were not very well reported. And this has huge implications on how you actually understand the data, because obviously you need to know how the data was collected to be able to fully understand what the results mean. So again, in this study, in this project, we found that for the majority, so that's nearly 60% of the articles, were not providing a method that was clear. So this is the methods that they collect, how they collected samples, how they extracted the phytoliths from the soil, which is what we do in a lab for phytolith analysis. So that wasn't clear. Also things like counting methods as well. We did a sort of look to see whether we thought we could replicate the methods, and half we found we couldn't really do that. We also looked at instruments, that was pretty clear. And then the bottom one is our nomenclature. So this is about naming the phytoliths. So this is something that people have tried to standardize over the years. We have 2 different standard nomenclatures for phytolith research, which are called ICPN 1 and 2, which is on the bottom of the slide. But we found that even though people are trying to implement these, we looked a little bit deeper to see if they'd actually fully used it. And actually, when we really examined the articles, it was clear to us that actually most of the people that said they had used a particular standard hadn't actually used it fully, and still their data was very unclear then. And this is a problem that we actually need to really tackle, is just to make everything clear, like about what you actually do, and transparent, how you've done something. And there's a specific way of naming things that aren't in the nomenclature, and people hadn't really followed that very much. So that was quite an interesting finding. So the really important thing, the data, it's a really sort of sad story of, like, as I've said, there's no data in repositories. We found 2% of the data in those. So 2 articles out of 100 articles had put their data into a data repository. Even some of them had not provided any data at all. So we counted data as in like a data table. That was the minimum of providing data. So we don't really count graph as providing data, because you can't really, you could maybe think about what numbers were in the graph, but it's quite difficult to get an accurate data set from somebody else's graph. So yeah, so that wasn't a great finding, but something to spur us on, I think. That also has implications on the type of data that was reported in these articles. So most of it is not raw data, it's some sort of process data. And that actually, again, has implications on how you can reuse the data. So you can't really reuse someone's process data set. You need to see the full raw data to be able to reuse it for like somebody else's research, combine it with their data set. And then also the format of the data was shared in. So it's mostly shared in tables, in articles. So that's not great for reusability or easy reusability. It takes a lot of time for people to take data out of articles and into spreadsheets for using. So it's if we try and move people to using repositories, that's going to have an implication on the types of files that they actually put in those repositories, because it's best practice to use Excel spreadsheets, or CSV files is better into those data repositories. So that kind of move of trying to get our data into data repositories is going to have like a cascading effect on the quality of the data that's put there. I haven't got more. Fabiana, how many more minutes have I got? 5 more minutes?
I think if you can make it in 2, it would be better, so we have more time for questions.
Okay, I will try and be really quick. So I've kind of said, I'm just sort of summarizing the findings. Basically, we can't find our data. It's super hard to find, and we need to improve that. In terms of the accessibility, so the A of FAIR, it's pretty much all inaccessible. I've said half of it, you can't even access the articles, so you can't access that data. So again, we need to be putting things into repositories. The interoperability thing is the major sticking point in this discipline. We need to implement our standard nomenclatures, or at least say what we've done with the naming in a very transparent way. We're actually starting a project to work on an ontology, which we think is one of the solutions to this project. So an ontology is a way of comparing different nomenclatures and naming systems. So that actually means that people don't need to use one specific one. It's a bit like a code book where you can actually work out what people have done in different ways. So we think that ontology is really the way to go for Phytoliths. And in terms of reusability, very little data at the moment is reusable. There's just not enough information to be able to reuse other people's data because they don't publish transparent methods, the way they collect data, the metadata, so the data about the data. And there's not really enough raw data out there in a reusable sort of file format. So it's really hard to understand and get data to be able to reuse it. So what we're doing at the moment is we are, as I said, we're making some recommendations and we're going to produce some FAIR guidelines. What we're doing very much at the moment is trying to consider like how much needs to be in these guidelines, because obviously researchers, a lot of them are quite at the beginning of really changing their habits of how they publish data. So we don't want to scare people off. We want this to be a positive change for our community. So we're talking to our community a lot at the moment about how to actually start implementing these or suggesting implementing these FAIR guidelines. Why is this project really important? Because we've actually taken a real community approach. This project is wider than just our project team. We've actually established a committee within our international society. So we're called ICOPS, which is the International Committee of Open Phytolith Science. And this really started off with me working in the COVID pandemic on my own when we were in lockdown, doing a little bit of research myself, coming into us having the FAIR Phytolith project, but now we're a much wider committee and a big open community where we come together and we do training together. We have discussions about like the FAIR guidelines that we're trying to develop, open publishing guidelines. So it's become sort of a much more flourishing community now that is really together, working together to try and move towards open science in our discipline. So the things we've done, I said we've done a lot of upskilling. We've got the FAIR Phytolith project, the ontology project as well. One of the things I'm most proud of is we made a multilingual website as well. So as I said, language is a real huge thing. So lots of researchers are in South America. So Spanish is a big language, but also we have loads that are in China. So our website is in, I think, English, French, Spanish, and Mandarin. So I think it's a really exciting sort of thing that we're trying to do. It's not perfect. Don't go and criticize it, but we're working on it as a community. So we're improving it all of the time. So just a few messages to finish is if you're a bit scared of open science, you haven't done anything, just try and do one thing. So this is a really good diagram. It's called the rainbow, I think, of open science. And it has lots of different sorts of practice that you could start doing. So maybe your next article, try and make sure it's open access. That's quite an easy one to do. I just want to advertise the Turing Way project. It's my favorite project of all projects. It's where we're building an open source guide on data science. So we have a huge global community that are working with us. We have different guides, which are about reproducibility, about ethics, about collaboration, project design and communication. And come and see our book. It's openly available online. It's a really great sort of open education project. You can come into our community as well. We have events every few weeks. We also do like hackathon weeks as well, which we call a book dash, which you can come and do writing. I love writing, so it really sort of scratches a bit of an itch that I have for writing my own book, which I don't actually have time for. So I do all my writing in the Turing Way project. So do come and join us. And lastly, just thanks so much for listening. I haven't done this work on my own, so thank you very much to the FAIR Phytolith team and also the ICOPS committee members, which are all listed here. Thanks to our project organisations, Historic England and the University of Fabra, Pompeu Fabra in Barcelona, and also our funders, which are EOSC Life. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Karoune. Actually, if you could share your presentation for a second longer.
Oh, sorry.
I can just announce the next lecture. And in the meantime, for everybody listening, this is the perfect time to write your questions in the Q&A box so that our speaker can answer them in a second. And please join also our next lecture coming on February 22nd, where Professor Bernard Blumich will present to us the portable NMR for structural diagnostic in heritage science, 3 p.m. Rome time. And please register on the E-RIHS website. Thank you very much.